Welcome, dear listeners, to a story that transcends time and teaches us about the transformative power of true love. In the coming minutes, I will narrate a story that will transport us to the elegant and contradictory imperial Rio de Janeiro of 1852, where family secrets and forbidden passions intertwine like silk threads in a tapestry of emotions. This is the story of Rosa, a young woman whose noble blood flows through veins marked by prejudice, and whose pure heart will defy the rigid social structures of her time. Can love overcome the barriers imposed by an implacable society? Will a flower born in shadows be able to bloom under the light of nobility? Before we begin, I would love to know, from what beautiful corner of the world are you joining us today? Leave it in the comments. And if this story manages to touch your heart as I hope, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like so more people can discover these literary gems that time has given us. Year 1852, Rio de Janeiro, Imperial Brazil. In the elegant salons of the Botafogo Palace, where the sea breeze caresses French silk curtains, the first lights of dawn filtered like golden fingers through the French damask curtains of the imposing Botafogo Palace. From the first-floor windows, the view extended majestically over Guanabara Bay, where emerald waters reflected the white sails of brigantines arriving laden with spices and dreams from distant lands. The palace, an architectural jewel of neoclassical style, rose like a silent testimony to the power and wealth accumulated over generations by the Mendonça e Albuquerque family. Its Carrara marble columns supported balconies adorned with wrought iron, while its gardens extended in terraced steps until they were lost among the imperial palm trees that bordered the property. At the heart of this magnificence, Viscount João Carlos de Mendonça e Albuquerque breakfasted in solitude. At 52 years old, his face retained the hardness of one who had forged a fortune based on implacable decisions in the sugar mills and coffee plantations of the Paraíba Valley. His grey eyes, cold as Toledo steel, scrutinized the morning newspapers, while he savored coffee served in Sèvres porcelain. A few meters away in the upper salons, his wife, Adelaide Christina, meticulously prepared her daughter Eugenia's day. The Viscountess, descendant of a lateral branch of the Bragança family, had brought to the matrimonial union the coats of arms of a decadent Portuguese nobility, but her blue blood compensated for any decrease in the family fortune. Eugenia, 18 years old, was the masterpiece of this calculated aristocracy. Educated by Madame Colette Dubois, a French governess with impeccable credentials, she mastered French with the fluency of a Parisian, executed Chopin pieces on the piano with technical skill, and danced the most complex Viennese contradances. Her beauty, blonde and ethereal like a Watteau canvas, had been molded to conquer the most exclusive salons of the imperial court. However, in the rear gardens of the palace, where the shadows of the jacaranda trees created a refuge of perfumed penumbra, existed a secret that the family guarded with the same zeal that protected their coffers filled with gold. Rosa awakened each morning in the small wooden chalet that rose discreetly among the hydrangeas and coconut palms. At 19 years old, her dark beauty contrasted dramatically with the artificial pallor valued in aristocratic salons. Her eyes, the color of wild honey, held a depth that spoke of solitary afternoons and dreams, whispered to the flowers she cared for with maternal devotion. Dona Maria das Dores Santos, the 60-year-old cook who had served the family for 3 decades, was the only person in the palace who knew Rosa's true story. On full moon nights, when the perfume of jasmine intensified until it became almost tangible, the old woman told her fragments of the truth. Rosa was the daughter of the Viscount and Esperança, a maid of extraordinary beauty who had died of puerperal fever just 3 days after childbirth. The secret had been buried along with Esperança in the small slave cemetery, but Rosa grew like a wildflower that, no matter how much one tries to hide it, always finds a way to reach the sunlight. While Eugenia prepared for another day of piano and French embroidery lessons, Rosa walked barefoot along the Portuguese stone paths, watering the rare orchids she had managed to cultivate in improvised greenhouses among the palm trees. Her hands, hardened by work but delicate in their movements, caressed the silky petals while she whispered melodies she had learned by listening to the musical lessons that filtered from the palace windows. The apparent harmony of that February morning was interrupted when a servant came running from the main gate. waving a sealed envelope with the imperial seal. The viscount received the correspondence with hands that barely managed to hide the tremor of expectation. The sender was none other than Rodolfo Henrique de Bourbon y Castro, Count of Ipanema, one of the most influential men in Dom Pedro II's court. What secrets did that letter contain that would shake the foundations of the Botafogo Palace? The sealed envelope rested on the mahogany table like a golden promise. The viscount contemplated it for long minutes before breaking the seal with the ceremony that deserved a document of such importance. The elegant calligraphy of the Count of Ipanema danced on the vellum paper, each word carefully chosen according to the most refined protocols of aristocratic correspondence. "Most excellent Lord Viscount of Botafogo," the missive began, "it is my honor to request an audience in your distinguished palace to discuss matters of mutual interest concerning the future of our illustrious families." Adelaide Christina clutched the back of her chair when her husband communicated the letter's contents to her. The Count of Ipanema, heir to one of the most solid fortunes in the empire, formally requested Eugenia's hand in marriage. The alliance represented not only the union of two patrimonies, but direct access to the emperor's inner circle, where the political and economic destinies of the nation were decided. Eugenia received the news with the composure she had learned in her etiquette lessons, but inside her heart galloped like her father's Arabian horses. At 18, she already saw herself as Countess of Ipanema, presiding over the most exclusive balls of the court, rubbing elbows with European princesses and ambassadors from the great powers. Madame Dubois was immediately summoned to intensify the young woman's education. French lessons were extended to include notions of diplomacy. Piano classes incorporated pieces by composers favored by European aristocracy, and protocol studies now covered the intricate rituals of presentation before His Imperial Majesty. While the palace transformed into a hotbed of preparations, Rosa continued her silent routine in the gardens. Donna Maria das Dores had secretly initiated her in letters, using the same textbooks that Madame Dubois employed with Eugenia. During siestas, when the palace was immersed in tropical drowsiness, the old cook taught her to read aloud fragments of Camões and Machado de Assis. Rosa absorbed knowledge like her orchids absorbed morning dew. Her natural intelligence, freed from the rigidities of aristocratic protocol, flourished with a spontaneity that contrasted dramatically with Eugenia's calculated education. While Eugenia memorized etiquette rules, Rosa devoured romantic novels that Donna Maria das Dores obtained from servants of other noble houses. The differences between both young women became more evident each day. Eugenia, accustomed to being the center of attention, developed a subtle cruelty toward Rosa. During visits from family friends, she would manage to humiliate the dark-skinned young woman, sending her to fetch water or flowers as if she were a simple servant. Rosa endured these slights with a dignity that sprang from the depths of her being. Her honey-colored eyes would darken momentarily, but she never lost composure. Instead of responding with resentment, she took refuge among her orchids, where she found the comfort that people denied her. One particularly hot February afternoon, while Eugenia practiced waltzes on the piano, Rosa discovered an orchid of unknown variety that had bloomed in one of her improvised greenhouses. The flower, with white petals streaked with gold, seemed to shine with its own light among the intense green of the leaves. The young woman contemplated it with almost religious reverence, recognizing in that wild beauty a reflection of her own soul. Without knowing that that orchid would become the symbol of her destiny, Rosa carefully transplanted it to the main garden, where it could receive the full light of the morning sun. It was as if she unconsciously prepared to emerge herself from the shadows where she had grown. The palace breathed expectation as March arrived, and with it the agreed date for the Count of Ipanema's visit. The servants polished every surface until it gleamed like mirrors. The gardeners pruned each bush with military precision, and Eugenia intensified her piano rehearsals until the late hours of the night. But destiny, with its characteristic irony, had already decided that the best-laid plans of human ambition could crumble before the overwhelming force of true love. The dawn of March 15, 1852, brought with it a different sea breeze, laden with omens that only the most sensitive hearts could perceive. Rosa awakened with strange uneasiness, as if the air itself vibrated with unknown energy. While watering her orchids, She noticed that the white and golden flower she had transplanted to the main garden had doubled the number of its petals during the night. In the palace, preparations reached their culmination. Adelaide Christina personally supervised the arrangement of each piece of baccarat crystal in the main dining room, while the Viscount reviewed for the umpteenth time the selection of port wines and French champagne that would be served during lunch. Eugenia, dressed in a sky-blue silk dress that Madame Dubois had specially commissioned for the occasion, rehearsed once more the steps of the contredanse she would perform after lunch. Her movements, technically perfect, lacked, however, the natural grace that springs from the heart when it is truly excited. The Count of Ipanema had announced his arrival for 11 in the morning. His entourage, according to prior correspondence, would include 5 carriages with golden shields and an escort of riders mounted on Andalusian horses. The ostentation was part of the protocol, but also a declaration of power that would not go unnoticed in the Botafogo neighborhood. Donna Maria das Dores had been working since before dawn preparing the banquet. Her expert hands had created a menu that combined the most refined French cuisine with touches of Luso-Brazilian culinary tradition. The aroma of exotic spices mixed with the perfume of jasmine that Rosa had cut to decorate the salons. At 10:30, the sound of hooves on cobblestones announced the arrival of the vanguard. The wrought iron gates opened ceremoniously to give way to a procession that seemed taken from a fairy tale. The Andalusian horses, with black coats shining like ebony, advanced with measured step while their riders, uniformed in navy blue with golden braids, maintained impeccable formation. The main carriage was a rolling work of art. Built in Paris by the best artisans of Rue Saint-Honoré, its body lacquered in forest green displayed mother-of-pearl inlays that formed the coat of arms of the Bourbon et Castro family. The horses that pulled it, 4 magnificent dapple grey specimens, wore repoussé leather harnesses with solid silver fittings. When the carriage stopped in front of the main staircase of the palace, an expectant silence took hold of the atmosphere. The servants, formed in double file according to protocol, waited with slightly bowed heads. The Viscount and his family had positioned themselves in the marble portico, while Adelaide Christina radiated barely contained satisfaction. The carriage door opened slowly, and the first foot that touched the ground wore an English leather boot, polished to mirror shine. Rodolfo Enrique de Bourbon et Castro, Count of Ipanema, descended with the natural elegance of one who has been born at the summit of the social pyramid. At 29 years old, the Count possessed that masculine beauty that combined Iberian distinction with French refinement. His eyes, of a deep blue like the ocean on summer afternoons, contrasted with chestnut hair worn styled according to the latest Parisian fashion. His bearing, erect without rigidity, radiated that serene confidence that only centuries of noble lineage united with careful education can grant. He wore an English cloth suit in pearl grey tone, complemented with a brocaded silk vest and Irish linen tie. On his lapel shone discreetly the insignia of the Order of Christ, the highest decoration that the Brazilian emperor could bestow. The greetings developed according to established ritual. The Count kissed Adelaide Christina's hand with the gallantry of a Versailles courtier, shook the Viscount's right hand with respectful firmness, and finally bowed before Eugenia with the reverence due to a lady of her rank. "Most excellent miss," he murmured with a grave and well-modulated voice, "your father did not exaggerate when describing your beauty in his correspondence." Eugenia responded with a perfect curtsy, keeping her eyes modestly lowered according to protocol rules. Her heart, however, beat wildly as she evaluated the man who could become her husband. The tour of the palace's main salons transpired as planned. The Count showed genuine interest in the collection of colonial sacred art that the Viscount had assembled over decades, and praised with knowledge the selection of 18th-century French furniture that decorated the noblest chambers. It was during the walk through the gardens that destiny decided to manifest itself in the most unexpected way. The garden of the Botafogo Palace extended like a living tapestry, designed by artists who understood the secret language of flowers. Portuguese stone paths meandered among geometric parterres where French roses shared space with tropical begonias, while imperial palm trees created natural colonnades that framed views toward the bay. The Count of Ipanema walked alongside the host family, stopping occasionally to admire some particularly rare specimen, or to comment on the gardening techniques that he evidently mastered. His European education had included notions of botany, and he immediately recognized the mastery with which native species had been combined with imported ornamental plants. "Your gardeners possess exceptional talent," he commented, addressing the Viscount. "The hybridization of these orchids must require very specialized knowledge." It was then when, upon turning a bend in the main path, the group found themselves before the improvised greenhouse where Rosa cared for her most delicate plants. The young woman, oblivious to the visitor's presence, bent over a clay pot where an orchid of extraordinary beauty sprouted. Her hands, moist from the dew she had collected to water the flowers, caressed the petals with a tenderness that spoke of years of silent dedication. She wore a simple white cotton dress that highlighted the golden tone of her skin, and wore her black hair gathered in a braid that fell over her right shoulder. Upon hearing the voices, she straightened slowly, and when she raised her eyes, her honey-colored gaze met directly with the Count's blue stare. It was a moment that seemed suspended in time, as if the universe had stopped its rotation to allow two souls to recognize their common destiny. Rosa felt something ignite in the depths of her being, a flame she had never imagined could exist. The Count, for his part, experienced a commotion that transcended everything he had believed he knew about love. Rosa's beauty was not the calculated beauty of aristocratic salons. It was the natural beauty of one who has grown in harmony with the elements, without artifice or pretensions. Her eyes reflected a spiritual depth that contrasted dramatically with the cultivated superficiality of the society in which he habitually moved. "And who is this young gardener?" asked the Count with a slightly hoarse voice, unable to look away from that face that had instantly engraved itself in his memory. The Viscount experienced a moment of barely disguised panic. She is Rosa, a young woman who helps us with the care of the most delicate plants," he murmured, carefully omitting any reference to the true family ties. Rosa inclined her head in a respectful greeting, but when she raised her eyes again, the Count could read in them a natural intelligence that he had not found in any of the salons he frequented. It was like contemplating a rough diamond, whose inner light shone more intensely than the most elaborately cut jewels. "The orchids are magnificent," commented the Count, addressing Rosa directly with a naturalness that surprised the entire entourage. "How long have you been cultivating this particularly unusual variety?" Rosa's voice, when she finally spoke, had the soft melody of one who has learned to modulate her words in solitude. "3 years, Excellence. It is a hybridization I achieved by combining a native species with seeds I obtained from a merchant who had traveled to the Orient." The conversation that followed revealed botanical erudition that left the Count genuinely impressed. Rosa explained with simplicity complex concepts about grafting and cross-pollination, demonstrating knowledge she had acquired through pure intuition and patient observation. Eugenia, who had remained slightly apart during this exchange, felt how a cold fury took hold of her being. She instinctively recognized the attraction that radiated between the Count and that dark-skinned girl, and understood that all her matrimonial plans were in danger before a rival she had not even considered. The garden walk extended longer than planned, mainly because the Count seemed fascinated by the explanations Rosa provided about each rare species. His European education allowed him to appreciate the depth of the young woman's knowledge, and he began to suspect that behind that apparent simplicity hid exceptional intelligence. When they finally returned to the palace for lunch, Eugenia had already made a decision that would mark the destiny of all involved. While the diners delighted in the delicacies prepared by Donna Maria das Dores, she mentally designed a strategy that would allow her to eliminate forever the threat that Rosa represented to her ambitions. The Count, for his part, found it almost impossible to concentrate on the after-dinner conversation. His thoughts returned again and again to those honey-colored eyes that had awakened in him emotions he believed impossible. For the first time in his life, he had found someone who attracted him not for her social position or fortune, but for the purity of her soul. When the time came for his departure, he formally requested permission to make new visits to the palace, ostensibly to continue courting Eugenia, but actually moved by the irresistible desire to again contemplate the young woman of the gardens. The Viscount agreed enthusiastically, interpreting the request as confirmation of the Count's matrimonial intentions. Adelaide Christina radiated satisfaction, convinced that her daughter had definitively conquered the empire's most coveted suitor. Only Eugenia knew the truth. The battle for the Count of Ipanema's heart had just begun, and she had no intention whatsoever of losing it. The days that followed the Count of Ipanema's first visit were characterized by a subtle but perceptible transformation in the atmosphere of the Botafogo Palace. Like flowers that open imperceptibly at the touch of the morning breeze, feelings began to bloom in directions no one had foreseen. The Count returned 3 days later with the pretext of examining more carefully the Viscount's collection of colonial art, but his steps inevitably led him toward the gardens where Rosa cultivated her orchids. He found her at dawn, when dew still pearled the petals, and the air was perfumed with the intense fragrance of night jasmine. "Good morning, Rosa," he greeted her with a naturalness that surprised them both. "I hope I'm not interrupting your work with the flowers." She raised her eyes from the pot she was transplanting, and again experienced that sensation of profound recognition she had felt during their first encounter. "Good morning, Excellence. I was just transplanting this orchid that has developed a very complex root system." The conversation flowed with the spontaneity proper to kindred souls. The Count, freed from the rigidities of aristocratic protocol, discovered in Rosa an interlocutor whose natural intelligence more than compensated for her lack of formal education. She, for her part, found in him someone who genuinely appreciated her knowledge without condescension or paternalism. "How did you learn so much about botany?" he asked, while contemplating the precision with which she manipulated the plant's delicate roots. "The books that Donna Maria das Dores lends me, and mainly observation," Rosa responded with simplicity. "Plants have their own language. One only has to learn to listen to them." During the following days, these morning conversations became a routine that both awaited with growing anxiety. The Count discreetly modified his schedules to arrive at the palace when the rest of the family still slept, and Rosa began to rise earlier to have the most beautiful plants arranged for his contemplation. Eugenia soon perceived this change in the Count's habits. Her piano lessons, scheduled for mornings with the aim of impressing the suitor, now unfolded before an absent audience. When she asked about him, the servants invariably informed her that he was strolling through the gardens. The young aristocrat decided to investigate personally. One morning she rose before dawn and positioned herself strategically behind the library curtains, from where she had a partial view of Rosa's greenhouses. What she contemplated confirmed her worst fears. The Count and Rosa conversed with an intimacy that transcended mere courtesy, and in his eyes shone an admiration he had never shown during his formal encounters with her. Madame Dubois became the confidant of Eugenia's concerns. The French governess, with her characteristic pragmatism, analyzed the situation with calculating coldness. "Ma chère Eugenia," she told her during one of their French sessions, "a man may feel attracted by the novelty of the exotic, but he always returns to what corresponds to his social class. Your advantage lies in your lineage and your education. That girl, however attractive she may be, can never offer him what you represent." But Eugenia had the intuition that this situation transcended a simple passing attraction. She had observed the way the Count contemplated Rosa and recognized in that gaze the intensity of true love. She then decided to set in motion a plan that would allow her to learn about her rival's past and eventually use it against her. She began by discreetly bribing the younger servants to obtain information about Rosa. Thus she discovered that the young woman had arrived at the palace as barely a child, that Donna Maria das Dores had raised her like a daughter, and that vague rumors existed about her true origin. Parallel to this, Rosa lived the most beautiful days of her existence. The conversations with the Count had opened before her a world of possibilities she had never imagined. He lent her books from his personal library, works of botany and literature, that expanded her intellectual horizons in a vertiginous manner. "You have an extraordinary mind," the Count told her one morning, while they contemplated together an orchid that had bloomed during the night. "It's a pity that society doesn't recognize talent when it doesn't come accompanied by noble titles." Rosa felt her heart accelerate at these words, which seemed to hint at possibilities that her reason refused to contemplate. "Each person has their place in the world, Excellence," she murmured with barely audible voice. "Mine is among these flowers. And if your place could be another?" he asked with an intensity that made her raise her eyes to find herself again with those blue eyes that deeply disturbed her. It was at that moment, when both understood they had crossed the invisible line that separates mutual admiration from true love. Without words, without dramatic gestures, simply through a gaze that lasted barely a few seconds, they recognized each other as souls destined to find each other despite all the barriers society might interpose between them. Donna Maria das Dores, who observed these developments from the prudent distance of her culinary obligations, felt how a mixture of joy and concern took hold of her maternal heart. She knew better than anyone the obstacles that would rise before such love, but she also recognized in Rosa the same nobility of spirit she had admired in her mother Esperanza. The storm that was approaching began to manifest in subtle ways. Longer gazes, conversations that extended until midday, and a growing complicity that was evident to anyone who observed them with attention. Eugenia had seen enough to understand that she needed to act with speed and decision if she wanted to preserve her matrimonial plans. The investigation into Rosa's past intensified, and soon she would obtain the information she needed to definitively destroy the hopes of that young woman who dared to compete with an aristocrat of her lineage. The revelation came through Madame Dubois, who had managed to extract the truth from the lips of a veteran servant during one of her discreet inquiries. The French governess burst into Eugenia's chambers with triumphant expression, carrying the definitive weapon that would allow her to eliminate forever the threat that Rosa represented. "Ma petite," she announced with her Parisian accent more pronounced by emotion, "I have discovered something that will completely change your situation. Rosa is not simply a protégée of the family. She is your father's natural daughter." Eugenia felt how her blood froze in her veins. The information was simultaneously devastating and perfect for her purposes. Devastating because it confirmed that Rosa possessed noble blood, though bastard. Perfect because that same origin converted her into a walking scandal that no man of the Count's position could publicly associate with his name. "Are you certain of this information?" she asked with controlled voice, while her mind already began to plot the implications of this discovery. Madame Dubois nodded gravely. "She died giving birth, and your father decided to raise the child in secret, but without ever officially recognizing her." This revelation explained many things that Eugenia had observed without fully understanding. The exceptional tolerance her father showed toward Rosa, the education that Donna Maria das Dores had provided her clandestinely, and even certain physical traits that, now that she knew to look for them, she recognized as similar to those of the Mendonça e Albuquerque family. The mother was a maid called Esperanza, considered one of the most beautiful women who had worked in this palace. But far from being intimidated by this complication, Eugenia saw in it the perfect opportunity to definitively eliminate her rival. A plan began to form in her mind, a plan that would require consummate acting, discreet complicity, and a calculated cruelty she didn't know she possessed until that moment. "Madame Dubois," she said with measured voice, "I need you to help me protect my family's honor and my marriage's future. What I'm going to propose requires absolute discretion." The French governess, who had dedicated her life to serving European aristocracy, immediately understood that she found herself before one of those situations that define destinies. Her loyalty toward Eugenia, cultivated during years of shared education, led her to nod without reservations. The plan they designed was of diabolical sophistication. First, it would be necessary to create false evidence demonstrating that Rosa had been deliberately seducing the Count for interested purposes. Second, they would have to find a way to physically remove Rosa from the palace before she could defend herself against the accusations. Third, when the Count discovered the truth about Rosa's manipulations, it would already be too late for him to locate her and verify her version of events. Madame Dubois took charge of the plan's first phase. Using her educated calligraphy, she drafted a series of letters supposedly written by Rosa to the Count, in which the young woman confessed her love, but also revealed mercenary motivations. The letters were written with sufficient subtlety to seem authentic, including references to real conversations they had maintained, and details about orchids that only Rosa could know. For the second phase, Eugenia counted on the collaboration of two servants who had accumulated gambling debts and desperately needed money. She offered them a considerable sum in exchange for a service she vaguely described as discreetly transferring Rosa to a place where she could reflect on her inappropriate behavior. The moment chosen for executing the plan was a new moon night, when darkness would provide the necessary cover to act without witnesses. Rosa had developed the habit of staying late in the gardens, caring for her nocturnal orchids, and this predictable routine would greatly facilitate the task of her captors. Meanwhile, the Count continued his morning visits, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. His feelings toward Rosa had evolved from initial admiration to a passion that consumed him day and night. He had begun to seriously consider the possibility of breaking his unofficial engagement with Eugenia to propose marriage to Rosa, aware that such a decision would provoke a social scandal of monumental proportions. "Rosa," he told her one morning, while they contemplated together the sunrise from the garden lookout, "I have been thinking a lot about our conversations. I believe the time has come for me to make certain important decisions regarding my future." She felt her heart accelerate at the intensity of those words, but her natural prudence led her to respond with caution. "Excellence, your future must be guided by reason and by your social obligations. A person like me should not influence decisions of such magnitude. And if I told you that you have already influenced my heart definitively," he murmured, gently taking one of her hands in his. Rosa felt the world sway around her. During all those weeks, she had tried to keep her feelings under control, constantly reminding herself of the impossibility of her situation. But now, before the Count's implicit declaration, she could no longer deny the truth that burned in her own heart. "My heart has also been touched irreversibly," she whispered with barely audible voice, "but I fear our worlds are too different for a common future to exist." "True love can overcome any barrier," he responded, with the conviction of one who has finally found the meaning of his existence. "Give me time to resolve certain obligations, and I will demonstrate that there are ways to build a future together." That night, Rosa returned to her chalet with a heart overflowing with hope and terror in equal parts. For the first time in her life, she dared to dream of a destiny that transcended the limitations of her origin. She could not imagine that at that very moment, the elements of her destruction were already being set in motion by someone she considered her half-sister. The new moon rose invisible over the Botafogo Palace, presaging a night that would forever change the course of multiple destinies. The dawn of March 21st found the Count of Ipanema waiting in vain in the palace gardens. For the first time in weeks, Rosa did not appear for their morning encounter. Her orchids, habitually cared for with maternal devotion, showed signs of abandonment that were inexplicable in someone so dedicated to her plants. Uneasy about this unusual absence, the Count headed toward the chalet where Rosa habitually resided. The small wooden construction rose silent among the palm trees, with its shutters closed and an air of desolation that contrasted dramatically with the vitality the young woman usually radiated. It was then that he discovered, strategically placed on the work table where Rosa cultivated her most delicate plants, a sealed envelope bearing his name, written in a calligraphy he immediately recognized. With slightly trembling hands, he broke the seal and unfolded a letter that would completely change his perception of recent events. "Most excellent Count," the missive began, "circumstances oblige me to abandon this place before my feelings lead me to commit actions that could dishonor both your person and the family that has given me refuge for so many years. I have understood that my affection toward you has grown beyond what corresponds to my social position, and I recognize that I have been nurturing hopes that could never materialize without provoking a scandal that would greatly harm you." The letter continued confessing an interested love, revealing supposed mercenary motivations, and concluding with a definitive renunciation of any romantic pretension. It was written with sufficient skill to seem convincing, but something in its tone didn't completely match the Rosa the Count had come to know during those weeks of growing intimacy. Confused and deeply hurt, the Count returned to the main palace in search of explanations. He found the family gathered in the breakfast salon, where Adelaide Christina commented with apparent concern about Rosa's mysterious disappearance during the night. "It has been very strange," the Viscountess said with thoughtful expression. "Donna Maria das Dores found her missing this morning, and all her belongings have disappeared. She only left a note telling us she had decided to seek fortune in another city." Eugenia, who had carefully rehearsed her role during the night, added with apparently pained voice, "I fear Rosa may have misinterpreted the kindness you showed her during your visits, Count. Some people of inferior class can confuse courtesy with something deeper. The Count contemplated Eugenia, with eyes that seemed to see for the first time the calculating coldness hidden behind her aristocratic beauty. Something in the too fluid manner with which she explained the situation awakened his suspicions, but the evidence of the letter seemed to confirm her words. "Did Rosa leave no indication of her destination?" he asked with controlled voice, though inside he experienced an emotional turbulence that surprised him with its intensity. The Viscount shrugged with apparent indifference. People of her condition tend to be unpredictable. Perhaps she found a better opportunity in some other noble house of Rio de Janeiro. But Dona Maria das Dores, who had remained silent during this exchange, could not contain any longer the anguish that consumed her. The old cook had raised Rosa like a daughter, and knew her character well enough to know she would never have abandoned her orchids without a more convincing explanation. "With your Excellency's pardon," she murmured, addressing the Count, "I raised that child since she was 3 years old, and I know she would never have abandoned her plants without appropriate care. Rosa loves those flowers more than her own life." The old woman's words fell like a stone in the apparently calm waters of the official version. The Count contemplated her with renewed interest, recognizing in her eyes the sincerity he had not found in the other family members. "Do you believe something else could have occurred?" he asked with soft but authority-laden voice. Dona Maria das Dores hesitated for some moments, aware that her next words could bring her grave consequences. But her maternal love for Rosa finally overcame her prudence. "Excellence, last night I heard strange noises in the gardens, as if there were men moving among the bushes. When I got up to investigate, everything seemed normal, but this morning I found horse tracks on the path leading to the rear gate." The Count felt how a cold fury took hold of him. His experience in the most refined circles of society had taught him to recognize palace intrigues, and he began to suspect that he had been victim of an elaborate manipulation. "Do you know if Rosa had enemies or people who might wish to harm her?" he asked with an intensity that made the entire family visibly tense. It was then that Adelaide Christina made the error that would crumble the entire construction of lies. In a moment of nervousness, she let slip a phrase that revealed more than she intended. Rosa was always complicated. Her origin made her an uncomfortable presence for certain family situations. "Her origin?" inquired the Count with dangerously soft voice. "What exactly do you refer to?" The silence that followed was so dense it seemed it could be cut with a sword. The Viscount exchanged a desperate glance with his wife, while Eugenia paled before the understanding that her plan was beginning to crumble. The Count of Ipanema slowly stood, and when he spoke his voice had the iron authority of one accustomed to having his orders obeyed without question. "I demand to know the complete truth about Rosa, about her origin, and about what really occurred last night. And I warn you that I have means to verify any information you provide me." The implicit threat was clear. The Count possessed direct connections with the Emperor and investigative resources that far transcended the possibilities of a provincial noble family. Faced with this pressure, and fearing the consequences of maintaining the deception before someone of such power, the Viscount found himself obliged to gradually reveal the truth. The confession emerged fragmentarily. Rosa was indeed his natural daughter, born from his relationship with the maid Esperanza. She had been raised in secret, maintained in the palace, but without official recognition. And yes, there had existed a conspiracy to remove her from the property due to the complications her presence had generated regarding the Count's courtship. When the complete truth was finally revealed, including the location where Rosa had been taken against her will, the Count experienced a transformation that terrified all present. His habitual elegance hardened until it became implacable determination, and his blue eyes acquired the steely gleam of one who has been betrayed in his deepest feelings. "Prepare horses and an escort immediately," he ordered, with a voice that admitted no replies. "Before this day ends, Rosa will be returned to this palace, or the consequences will fall upon all those involved in this conspiracy." The desperate search was about to begin. The morning of March 22nd dawned wrapped in mists that rose from Guanabara Bay like ghostly veils. The Count of Ipanema had spent the night organizing an expedition that would have epic characteristics. 6 riders mounted on the best horses from his stable, provisions for several days, and a local guide who knew every path of the Serra dos Órgãos. Madame Dubois, subjected to an interrogation that had finally broken her loyalty to Eugenia, had revealed the exact location where Rosa had been taken, an abandoned fazenda in the mountains near Petropolis, property of a distant cousin of the viscount, who had agreed to custody the young woman for some weeks in exchange for generous compensation. The count departed at dawn, followed by his escort, with his heart divided between hope and terror of what he might find. The 8 hours of horseback riding that separated them from their destination stretched before him, like an eternity populated by the worst omens. The path wound through valleys covered with Atlantic forest, where the sounds of civilization gradually faded until they were replaced by the chorus of cicadas and the whisper of wind among the tops of centennial cedars. The Andalusian horses, accustomed to ceremonial rides through Rio de Janeiro's avenues, responded valiantly to the challenge of mountainous terrain, as if they understood the urgency of the mission they were carrying out. During the hours of horseback riding, the Count had time to reflect on the intensity of the feelings Rosa had awakened in him. He had known many beautiful and intelligent women in European salons, but none had managed to touch the deepest fibers of his soul, like that dark-skinned young woman who cared for orchids with artists' hands. He now recognized that what he felt transcended mere physical or intellectual attraction. It was a spiritual recognition, the certainty of having found the person with whom to share not only a life, but also a common purpose. The morning conversations in the gardens had revealed to him a pure soul, incapable of the calculated manipulation that characterized the society in which he habitually moved. When the sun reached its zenith, the expedition stopped beside a crystalline stream to allow the horses to rest and drink. The Count took advantage of this respite to again question the guide about the characteristics of the fazenda that constituted their destination. "É uma propriedade antiga, Excelência," the man explained with his Portuguese tinged with rural accent. "Abandoned more than 10 years ago after a yellow fever epidemic decimated the region. Only the main house and some dependencies for workers remain standing." The description increased the Count's anxiety. An abandoned property in the mountains was not precisely the place where a young woman of Rosa's sensitivity could feel safe or comfortable. His fears intensified when the guide added that the fazenda lacked regular communications with nearby populations. The second half of the journey developed at a more accelerated pace, driven by the growing urgency the Count felt. The paths became steeper and rockier as they advanced into the foothills of the Serra, and the landscape acquired that wild grandeur that characterizes Brazil's mountainous regions. It was during the last 2 hours of horseback riding that they began to sight signs of the abandoned fazenda. Collapsed stone walls that delimited old pastures, remains of wooden fences rotted by tropical rains, and finally, silhouetted against the evening sky, the red clay roofs of the main buildings. The Count ordered his escort to approach with caution. He didn't know exactly what resistance they might encounter, nor in what conditions they would find Rosa after 2 days of involuntary captivity. The fazenda's main house rose like a ghost of more prosperous times. Its adobe walls, once whitewashed, now showed humid stains and cracks that betrayed years of abandonment. The wooden shutters hung asymmetrically from their rusted hinges, and tropical vegetation had begun to reclaim the terrain, partially covering the walls with flowering vines. But from one of the second-floor windows emerged a faint glow that indicated human presence. The Count felt his heart accelerate at the possibility that Rosa was indeed inside those melancholic ruins. The final approach was made in complete silence. The Count and 2 of his men dismounted at some distance from the house and approached on foot, while the rest of the escort remained with the horses, prepared for any eventuality. The fazenda's interior revealed partial abandonment. Some rooms had been recently cleaned and equipped with basic furniture, evidently to accommodate temporary guests. Following the trail of light they had sighted from outside, the Count cautiously climbed a wooden staircase that creaked under his steps. It was upon reaching the second floor that he heard, coming from a room locked with a key, the soft sound of a feminine voice murmuring what seemed to be a prayer. He immediately recognized Rosa's melodic cadence and felt how a mixture of relief and fury took hold of him. "Rosa," he called loudly, knocking firmly on the door. "It's Rodolfo. I've come to free you." The silence that followed was so profound he could hear his own heart beating wildly. Then, like a miracle, Rosa's voice responded from inside the room, weak but unmistakably real. "Rodolfo, is it really you?" The door yielded easily to the Count's desperate force. Rosa was by the window, still dressed in the simple white dress she wore on the day of her kidnapping, but with loose hair and the expression of one who has spent hours in vigil. Her eyes, when they met his, shone with a mixture of disbelief and hope that broke the Count's heart. "I thought I would never see you again," she murmured, while he enveloped her in an embrace that seemed to want to compensate for all the hours of anguish endured. "I will never allow them to separate you from me again," he responded, with voice hoarse from emotion. "I promise you by my honor and my life." The return journey was made in silence, with Rosa riding alongside the Count on his Andalusian horse. During the hours of descent from the mountains, both had opportunity to exchange complete versions of what had occurred. Rosa related her kidnapping and the 2 days of uncertainty she had endured, while the Count described the investigation process that had culminated in her rescue. It was during this shared horseback ride that both definitively understood their destinies were irreversibly united. The trials they had overcome had strengthened a love that was already solid, converting it into something that transcended social conventions. When the lights of Rio de Janeiro began to shine in the distance, Rosa finally dared to formulate the question that had tormented her during the entire journey. What will happen now? Will I be able to return to the palace after everything that has occurred? The Count's response was as definitive as it was unexpected. "You will return to the palace, but not as the Viscount's unrecognized daughter. You will return as my official fiancée, and anyone who opposes this decision will have to face me directly." The social revolution that was approaching had officially begun. The return to the Botafogo Palace had characteristics of a triumphal procession. The Count of Ipanema rode erect on his Andalusian horse, with Rosa mounted beside him, like a queen rescued from the claws of evil. His escort, formed in perfect military order, completed an image that would be forever engraved in the memory of those who witnessed it. The wrought iron gates opened ceremoniously before the entourage, but the silence that reigned in the palace contrasted dramatically with the agitation that had characterized the previous days. It was as if the entire property held its breath, aware that the events about to unfold would forever change the established order. On the main portico awaited the complete Mendonça e Albuquerque family. The Viscount, pale as the marble of his columns, maintained a composure that barely concealed the terror that confronting the consequences of his actions inspired in him. Adelaide Christina clutched her husband's arm, while Eugenia remained slightly apart, with her face decomposed by the understanding that all her plans had collapsed spectacularly. The Count dismounted with fluid elegance and helped Rosa down from the horse. When both were standing before the staircase, he took her hand in his and addressed the family with voice that combined aristocratic authority with unshakable determination. "Gentlemen," he announced with solemnity, "I have come to communicate a decision that will affect both your family honor and this extraordinary young woman's destiny. Rosa and I have decided to unite our lives in marriage." The silence that followed these words was so dense, it seemed to have physical substance. Eugenia felt how the world collapsed around her, while her parents experienced the vertigo of one who contemplates the abyss of their own social ruin. It was the Viscount who managed to articulate the first words. "Count, I understand that recent events may have altered your judgment, but you must consider the implications of what you propose. Rosa is my natural daughter, born of an illegitimate union. Her social position disqualifies her from becoming a countess." The Count's response was as fulminant as it was definitive. Social position is built upon merit and nobility of character, not solely upon accidents of birth. Rosa possesses a purity of soul and intelligence that surpass those of any lady I have known in the most refined salons of Europe. Rosa, who had remained silent during this exchange, felt how a mixture of love and terror took hold of her. She understood the magnitude of the sacrifice the Count was willing to make for her, but she also knew the social consequences such a decision would bring for both. "Rodolfo," she murmured with barely audible voice, "you cannot destroy your future for my sake. Your position at court, your relations with European nobility." He turned toward her with eyes that shone with a conviction that dispelled all her doubts. My future has no meaning without you. I have discovered that true nobility resides in the heart, not in inherited titles. I prefer to be a count married to the woman I love, even if that means facing rejection from a hypocritical society, than maintain a position built upon compromises that betray my deepest feelings. Adelaide Christina, partially recovering from the initial impact, attempted a final diplomatic recourse. Count, surely we could reach an arrangement that satisfies all parties. Rosa could receive a generous dowry and contract marriage with some prosperous merchant of the city. Your union with Eugenia would guarantee— There will be no arrangement, interrupted the Count with glacial voice. My decision is irreversible. Rosa will become my wife with all the prerogatives that correspond to a countess, or there will be no marriage at all in my future. It was then that Rosa, inspired by the courage that true love grants even to the most timid hearts, straightened with a dignity that completely transformed her presence. For the first time in her life, she allowed herself to speak with the authority conferred by both her natural intelligence and the noble blood that ran through her veins. I accept your marriage proposal, she declared with clear and firm voice, addressing the Count but keeping her gaze fixed on the Viscount's eyes. And I also accept the responsibilities that correspond to my new social position. But before becoming a countess, I want it to be clear that I have never sought this elevation for personal ambition. My only desire has been to find a place in the world where I can fully develop the capacities God has granted me. Rosa's speech electrified all present. Eugenia recognized with bitterness that she had completely underestimated her rival, while the Viscount experienced for the first time a feeling that approached paternal pride toward that daughter he had never officially recognized. The days that followed this public declaration were a whirlwind of activity and transformations. The Count used his connections with the imperial court to request a private audience with Dom Pedro II, where he personally explained the circumstances of his matrimonial decision. The emperor, known for his political pragmatism and his appreciation for romantic stories, granted his blessing to the union, recognizing that the initial scandal would be compensated by the precedent of social tolerance it would establish. Madame Dubois, repentant of her participation in the conspiracy, voluntarily offered to prepare Rosa in the most refined protocols of European aristocracy. During intensive weeks, the young woman learned the intricate rituals of palatial etiquette, perfected her French until achieving aristocratic fluency, and developed the social skills necessary to move with elegance in the empire's most exclusive circles. But the most notable aspect of this transformation was that Rosa managed to adapt to her new position without losing the spontaneity and purity that had originally conquered the Count's heart. Her natural intelligence absorbed the complexities of social protocol, but her soul preserved that freshness that distinguished her from ladies educated according to traditional molds. The official announcement of the engagement was published in the Gazeta de Rio de Janeiro, provoking waves of astonishment that extended from the salons of Botafogo to the palaces of Petropolis. Imperial society divided between those who condemned the decision as romantic madness and those who celebrated it as an example that true love could overcome the most rigid barriers. Meanwhile, Eugenia was forced to face the reality that her matrimonial ambitions had vanished forever. Her beauty and refined education were no longer sufficient to attract suitors of the Count of Ipanema's quality, especially after rumors about her participation in the conspiracy against Rosa began to circulate discreetly among high society. The wedding date was set for May 15, 1852, barely 2 months after Rosa's rescue. Time was pressing because the Count had decided the ceremony should take place in Rio de Janeiro before departing for Europe on a honeymoon that would last 6 months and would allow Rosa to perfect her education in the most refined salons of Paris and London. The social revolution initiated by his matrimonial decision was transforming not only their personal lives, but also the perceptions of a society that began to question its own prejudices about merit, nobility, and the transformative power of true love. The morning of May 15, 1852, dawned bathed in that golden light that only days destined for eternity seemed to possess. The Igreja do Carmo, located in the heart of Rio de Janeiro, had been adorned to receive a ceremony that would transcend the limits of a simple aristocratic marriage to become a historical event. Dom Pedro II had granted not only his blessing, but also his personal presence to the wedding, establishing a precedent that would resonate for decades in the annals of Brazilian imperial society. The emperor's decision to officially attend converted the union between the Count of Ipanema and Rosa into a state act that definitively legitimized the social transformation both represented. Rosa awakened in the chambers that had been assigned to her in the imperial palace, where she had resided during the last weeks under the direct protection of the court. Her wedding dress, made by the best dressmakers of Paris according to designs sent specially from France, was a masterpiece of Italian silk embroidered with pearls cultivated in Tahitian waters. When she contemplated herself in the full-length mirror, Rosa experienced a sensation of unreality that bordered on vertigo. The dark-skinned young woman who had grown among the orchids of the Botafogo Palace had transformed into a vision of elegance that rivaled the most refined European princesses. But the most notable aspect of this transformation was that Rosa had managed to preserve her fundamental essence. Her honey-colored eyes retained the spiritual depth that had originally conquered the Count, and her smile maintained that spontaneity that distinguished her from the calculated smiles of traditional aristocracy. At the Botafogo Palace, the Mendonça e Albuquerque family prepared to attend a ceremony that represented both their redemption and their humiliation. The Viscount had been officially rehabilitated by the emperor, who considered that publicly recognizing Rosa as his daughter constituted an act of belated but meritorious honorability. Adelaide Christina experienced contradictory feelings. On one hand, Rosa's marriage elevated family prestige to heights never imagined. On the other, evidence of her indirect participation in the conspiracy filled her with shame that would take years to dissipate. Eugenia, for her part, had been forced to accept an emergency marriage proposal from a prosperous but titleless merchant. João Baptista Ferreira, owner of the largest commercial houses in Santos, represented economic security, but not the social glory she had ambitioned throughout her life. The ceremony at the Igreja do Carmo surpassed in magnificence any social event celebrated in the empire during that decade. The pews were occupied by the cream of Brazilian and European aristocracy, including ambassadors from France, England, and Austria, who had been personally invited by the Count to witness his union. When Rosa advanced down the central aisle on the arm of the Viscount, who finally exercised his paternal role in public, a murmur of admiration ran through the nave. Her beauty, enhanced by the bridal dress and the education received during the previous months, radiated a dignity that definitively silenced any questioning about her suitability to become a countess. The Count of Ipanema awaited her before the altar, with the expression of one who contemplates the materialization of his deepest dreams. Dressed in the gala uniform of the Order of Christ, with decorations that shone like stars on the navy blue cloth, he represented the perfect incarnation of enlightened nobility. The ceremony was officiated by the Archbishop of Rio de Janeiro, who pronounced a homily about the redemptive power of true love that was commented upon for months in the empire's intellectual circles. His words established a parallel between Rosa and the Count's union and the great love stories that had transformed the course of history. "Love," he declared, with voice that resonated in the Gothic vaults of the church, "is the most democratic force in the universe, because it recognizes only nobility of heart and purity of soul. In this union, we contemplate the demonstration that God distributes his gifts without attention to human hierarchies." When the rings were exchanged, Rosa felt her previous life definitively vanish to give way to a future that surpassed any dream she had dared to imagine. The Count, upon placing the ring on her finger, murmured words that only she could hear. "With this ring I convert you not only into my wife, but into the queen of my heart for all eternity." The emperor's final blessing officially converted Rosa into Countess of Ipanema, with all the privileges and responsibilities that corresponded to such high position. Dom Pedro II, known for his erudition, took advantage of the occasion to make a declaration that would be remembered as one of the most progressive moments of his reign. "True nobility," he proclaimed, addressing the distinguished assembly, "is measured by the capacity to transform the world through love and wisdom. This young countess represents the future of a Brazil where personal merit will prevail over inherited privileges." The years that followed confirmed the wisdom of this exceptional union. Rosa adapted to her new position with a grace that surpassed the most optimistic expectations, becoming one of the most respected hostesses of imperial society. Her salons transformed into cultural centers where the most brilliant intellectuals of the era gathered. But her most significant contribution was the creation of charitable institutions that revolutionized the treatment of society's most vulnerable sectors. Inspired by her own experience of marginalization, she established orphanages, schools for children from humble families, and training programs that allowed talented young people to access educational opportunities regardless of their social origin. The marriage was blessed with 4 children, who grew up educated in principles of equality and social justice that were decades ahead of their time. Countess Rosa became a legendary figure, not only for the extraordinary love story she had lived, but for the way she used her privileged position to create a more just world. The Viscount of Botafogo, redeemed by the official recognition of his paternity and ennobled by Rosa's achievements, dedicated his last years to supporting his daughter's charitable works. Adelaide Christina found in this family collaboration a way to expiate her past errors. Eugenia, after an initial marriage marked by bitterness, finally managed to find modest but authentic happiness. Her children grew up admiring their Aunt Rosa, and the former rivalry gradually transformed into mutual respect that healed family wounds. The Botafogo Palace became a symbol of social transformation, where the rigid hierarchies of the past gave way to coexistence based on merit and genuine affection. The gardens where Rosa had cultivated her first orchids were transformed into a botanical museum bearing her name, perpetuating the memory of that extraordinary young woman who had demonstrated that true love can flourish even in the most adverse circumstances. The story of Rosa and the Count of Ipanema was transmitted from generation to generation as testimony that human dignity and purity of heart constitute the most authentic nobility, capable of transforming not only individual destinies, but also the most entrenched social structures. The first years of marriage between Rosa and the Count of Ipanema transpired like a golden dream that extended from Parisian salons to the beaches of Rio de Janeiro. Their European honeymoon had been a diplomatic and social triumph that definitively consolidated Rosa's position in international aristocratic circles. In Paris, the new countess was received by Empress Eugénie de Montijo, who found in her a refined intelligence that contrasted favorably with the superficiality of many European nobility ladies. The salons of the Faubourg Saint-Germain opened for her, and her story of social ascension was celebrated as an example of merit's triumph over circumstances of birth. London offered them even more enriching experiences. Rosa was presented to Queen Victoria, who showed genuine interest in the educational projects the young countess was already beginning to plan for her return to Brazil. The British monarch, known for her social pragmatism, saw in Rosa a natural ally for the reform movements that were beginning to transform Europe. But it was in London's museums and libraries that Rosa found definitive inspiration for her future philanthropic work. British educational institutions, which had begun to admit students from humble origins based solely on their intellectual capacity, showed her a model of social transformation that could be adapted to Brazilian reality. The return to Rio de Janeiro in December 1852 marked the beginning of a new phase in their lives. Countess Rosa had acquired during her European journey not only the sophistication veneer that her position demanded, but also a clear vision of the social reforms she wished to implement in her adoptive country. Her first project was the creation of the Esperança Orphanage, named in honor of her mother and destined to shelter abandoned children regardless of their racial or social origin. The institution, established on a property donated by the Count in the hills of Santa Teresa, revolutionized traditional concepts of charity by combining maternal care with high-quality education. The orphanage quickly became a model that attracted visitors from throughout the empire. Rosa had managed to create an environment where children received not only food and shelter, but also an education that included letters, numbers, arts, and practical trades that guaranteed them an independent future. Each child, the Countess explained to benefactors who visited the institution, possesses a unique talent that deserves to be developed. Our obligation is to provide them with the necessary tools so they can build their own destinies. The orphanage's success led to the creation of popular schools in various neighborhoods of Rio de Janeiro. These institutions, financed with their own funds and donations from progressive noble families, offered free education to children of workers, artisans, and small merchants who had traditionally been excluded from the formal educational system. Simultaneously, Rosa developed professional training programs for young women from humble families. Recognizing that economic independence was fundamental to personal dignity, she established workshops for sewing, embroidery, confectionery, and other skills that allowed these young women to establish their own small businesses. The Count of Ipanema enthusiastically supported these initiatives, contributing not only financial resources, but also his political influence to obtain official backing. His love for Rosa had deepened over the years, nourished by admiration for the way she used her privileged position to create opportunities for the less fortunate. In 1854, 2 years after their marriage, their first child was born, Rodolfo Carlos, who would eventually inherit the Count title. The child came into the world amid celebrations that extended throughout the Botafogo neighborhood, where Rosa had become a figure venerated for her generosity and wisdom. Motherhood transformed Rosa even more profoundly, awakening in her a visceral understanding of the responsibilities that come with nurturing and forming a new life. Her educational projects benefited from this personal experience, incorporating pedagogical methods that recognized each child's individuality. The second son, Carlos Henrique, was born in 1856, followed by Maria Rosa in 1858, and finally by Ana Esperanza in 1860. Each birth was celebrated not only by the family, but by the communities that had benefited from the Countess's works, who saw in these children the continuation of a legacy of social transformation. The Count and Countess's children grew up in a unique environment, where traditional aristocratic education combined with values of equality and social service. From a young age, they participated in the orphanage and popular schools activities, developing a natural understanding that their privileges carried responsibilities toward common welfare. During these years of family plenitude, Rosa maintained regular contact with Donna Maria das Dores, who had been transferred to the orphanage as kitchen director and had become the adoptive grandmother of all the sheltered children. The old woman, who had lived to see the triumph of the girl she had raised as her own daughter, found in this new function a personal fulfillment that compensated for the sorrows of her youth. The Botafogo Palace, under Rosa's indirect administration, had transformed into a center of philanthropic activity. The gardens where she had cultivated her first orchids were converted into experimental orchards, where scientific agriculture was taught to young people from rural families. The palace library was open to the public on specific days, allowing students from humble origins to access books and documents that were previously reserved for the aristocratic elite. This democratization of knowledge generated a generation of self-taught intellectuals who would contribute significantly to the country's cultural development. The Viscount of Botafogo, transformed by belated pride toward his recognized daughter, dedicated his last years to actively supporting these initiatives. His fortune, accumulated during decades of exploiting sugar plantations, finally found a noble purpose in financing projects that benefited descendants of those who had worked his lands. Adelaide Christina developed an almost religious devotion toward Rosa's works, finding in collaboration with her daughter-in-law a way to redeem the errors of judgment that had marked the first years of their coexistence. Her experience in domestic administration proved invaluable for the efficient organization of charitable institutions. Even Eugenia, initially resentful of her half-sister's success, was gradually conquered by the genuine generosity Rosa showed toward the entire family. When her own marriage went through economic difficulties, Rosa discreetly intervened to preserve her nephew's stability, demonstrating that her nobility of character transcended past rivalries. Countess of Ipanema's salons became centers of intellectual debate, where not only the latest European artistic trends were discussed, but also the social reforms necessary to modernize Brazil. Politicians, writers, scientists, and educators found in these gatherings a forum for exchanging progressive ideas. Rosa's influence transcended the limits of Carioca high society. Her letters were sought by social reformers from other provinces, and her educational methods, were adopted in cities as distant as Salvador de Bahia and São Paulo. This decade of plenitude confirmed that the Count's decision to defy social conventions had been not only correct from a personal standpoint, but also beneficial for society as a whole. The true love between Rosa and Rodolfo had generated fruits that enriched the lives of thousands of people who would never have had access to educational opportunities without the intervention of this exceptional couple. The year 1865 marked the 13th anniversary of the marriage between Rosa and the Count of Ipanema, coinciding with an era of profound transformations that shook the foundations of the Brazilian Empire. The Paraguayan War had begun, challenging traditional social structures and accelerating modernization processes that Rosa had anticipated in her educational projects. The Countess, now a 32-year-old woman, had reached the plenitude of her social and political influence. Her educational institutions had multiplied throughout the empire, establishing a network of schools and orphanages that educated more than 5,000 children, according to pedagogical methods revolutionary for the era. The Esperança orphanage had become a true popular university, where young people from humble origins could access knowledge that was traditionally reserved for the elite. The first graduates of these institutions were beginning to occupy important positions in public administration, commerce, and liberal professions, demonstrating that talent and education could effectively overcome social barriers. Rodolfo Carlos, the eldest son, had turned 11 and showed precocious intelligence that combined aristocratic sophistication with the social sensitivity inherited from his mother. His private tutors were amazed by his capacity to understand complex problems and his genuine interest in matters related to justice and equality. "Mama," he asked one day while visiting the orphanage, "why are some children born in palaces and others in straw huts?" Rosa's response revealed the philosophical depth she had developed during years of reflection on social inequalities. "Life distributes its gifts in mysterious ways, my dear son, but each person born with privileges has the responsibility to use them to create opportunities for those who didn't have them." The other children also manifested characteristics that reflected the exceptional education they received. Carlos Henrique, 9 years old, showed notable artistic talent and had already begun teaching drawing to children at the orphanage. Maria Rosa, 7 years old, had inherited her mother's botanical passion and cultivated an experimental garden where she developed new varieties of ornamental flowers. Ana Esperança, the youngest at 5 years old, possessed extraordinary social intuition that allowed her to connect instantly with children of any origin. Her natural capacity for empathy promised to convert her into a natural continua of the family's philanthropic work. The Count of Ipanema, for his part, had used his political influence to promote legislative reforms that facilitated the expansion of popular education. As a member of the State Council, he had achieved approval of laws that established public funds for constructing schools in rural areas and training teachers specialized in popular education. His love for Rosa had deepened over the years, enriched by mutual admiration and shared work on projects that transcended their personal interests. When he contemplated her directing the orphanage's activities or explaining complex concepts to students from humble origins, he experienced the same emotional commotion he had felt during their first encounter in the Botafogo Palace gardens. "Each day I fall more deeply in love with the extraordinary woman you are," he confessed to her one afternoon while they strolled through the gardens of their Botafogo residence, where the orchids originally cultivated by Rosa had proliferated to form a world-renowned collection. Her response revealed the emotional maturity she had achieved. True love grows when it feeds on shared purposes. "We have built together something that transcends our individual destinies." During these years, Rosa had maintained regular correspondence with educators and social reformers from Europe and the United States. Her letters were sought by personalities like Horace Mann in America and Friedrich Froebel in Germany, who recognized in her pedagogical methods innovations that could revolutionize global education. This international projection led to Rosa being invited to participate in the International Congress of Education that would be held in Paris in 1867. The invitation represented extraordinary recognition for a woman in an era when female participation in international academic forums was practically non-existent. The Count enthusiastically supported this participation, recognizing that Rosa's presence at the Congress would not only honor Brazil, but would also allow her to incorporate the latest European pedagogical advances into her educational institutions. Preparation for the trip to Paris became a family project. The children participated in selecting documents and materials that Rosa would present at the Congress, and the Count used his diplomatic contacts to guarantee that the Brazilian delegation had the necessary official backing. Simultaneously, the institutions created by Rosa continued expanding and perfecting themselves. The scholarship system she had established allowed especially talented young people to continue higher studies in Europe, creating a generation of Brazilian professionals educated according to the highest international standards, but committed to their native country's development. One of these scholarship recipients, José da Silva Paranhos, son of a shoemaker who had been educated in Rosa's school since age 6, had managed to enter the École Polytechnique of Paris and would return to Brazil converted into one of the most brilliant engineers of his generation. His personal story became a symbol of the transformative potential of democratic education. The Paraguayan War, which had begun in 1864, provided unexpected opportunities to demonstrate the efficacy of the educational methods developed by Rosa. Young people educated in her institutions showed literacy levels and technical knowledge superior to the national average, making them valuable candidates for administrative and technical positions in the war effort. The imperial government officially recognized this contribution, awarding Rosa the Order of the Rose, the highest decoration a woman could receive in the Brazilian Empire. The investiture ceremony, presided over by Dom Pedro II, became a national celebration of education's transformative power. In her acceptance speech, Rosa summarized the philosophy that had guided her work for more than a decade. True nobility does not reside in inherited titles, but in the capacity to use our gifts to elevate those around us. Each educated child represents a victory against ignorance and inequality. The applause that followed these words reflected unanimous recognition that Rosa had managed to transform not only her personal destiny, but also the future possibilities for thousands of Brazilians who would never have had access to educational opportunities without her intervention. As she prepared for her trip to Paris, Rosa reflected on the path traveled since that morning in 1852, when she had encountered the Count among her orchids. The love that had bloomed among the flowers had multiplied in forms neither could have imagined, creating a legacy that would endure far beyond their individual lives. The main salon of the Palais des Congrès in Paris was filled with the cream of European educational intellectuality. It was September 1867, and the International Congress of Education had brought together pedagogues, philosophers, and social reformers from throughout the civilized world. Among them, Rosa stood out not only for being one of the few women present, but for representing a unique experience of social transformation through democratic education. The Countess of Ipanema, now 34 years old, had achieved an intellectual maturity that radiated natural authority. Her presence, elegant but without ostentation, commanded immediate respect among personalities accustomed to dealing only with male academics of established prestige. Madame la Comtesse, Professor Heinrich Pestalozzi Jr., son of the famous Swiss pedagogue, greeted her. "Your experience in Brazil has awakened great curiosity among Congress participants. Would it be possible for you to explain how you have achieved such extraordinary results, starting from such complex social conditions?" The question posed the fundamental challenge Rosa had come to face: demonstrate that her educational methods could serve as a model for similar reforms in other societies. "Distinguished colleagues," Rosa began with clear voice that filled the ample salon, "I have learned that truly transformative education must be based on 3 fundamental principles: recognition of the inherent dignity of each human being, regardless of their origin; adaptation of pedagogical methods to each student's individual capacities; and integration of academic knowledge with practical skills that guarantee economic independence." Her exposition, developed over more than an hour, captivated the audience with concrete examples of individual and social transformations achieved in her institutions. During the previous days, she had sustained private conversations with representatives of various nations, all interested in understanding the principles that had made the success of her institutions possible. She described how José da Silva Paranhos, the shoemaker's son, had become an engineer, how Maria Santos, a girl found abandoned in Rio de Janeiro's streets, had developed such talent for mathematics that she now taught in one of the capital's most prestigious schools, how hundreds of young people had managed to establish prosperous small businesses thanks to technical training received. But, Rosa continued with an intensity that electrified the salon, the true miracle of democratic education does not reside solely in our students' individual achievements. It resides in the transformation of entire society when it recognizes that talent can flourish in the most unexpected terrains. Rosa's words resonated with special force because her own personal story perfectly embodied the principles she defended. The young woman who had grown among orchids, marginalized by her bastard origin, had become one of the most respected educators of her era, not despite her initial circumstances, but precisely because those circumstances had taught her to recognize the hidden potential in each human being. During the question period that followed her presentation, Rosa faced questionings that revealed European society's deepest prejudices. A German academic suggested that her methods might be appropriate for tropical races, but inadequate for the more developed European mentality. A French pedagogue insinuated that popular class education could generate social instability. It was then that Rosa experienced the most profound revelation moment of her adult life. She understood that the challenge she had faced in her youth, being judged by her origin instead of her merits, was reproduced on a global scale in attitudes toward popular education. Her personal struggle had become a symbol of a universal battle against prejudices and artificial limitations imposed on human potential. "Distinguished colleagues," she responded with a serenity that contrasted with the intensity of her internal emotions, "your concern for social stability reveals precisely the root of the problem we must resolve. A truly stable society is not one that maintains majorities in ignorance to preserve the privileges of a few, but one that allows each individual to fully develop their capacities and contribute to common welfare." Her words provoked tense silence, followed by applause that began timidly but intensified until becoming a prolonged ovation. Rosa had managed to articulate, before European intellectual elite, a vision of social justice that transcended national and racial borders. That night, in her suite at the Hôtel des Invalides, Rosa received an unexpected visit from a delegation headed by Victor Hugo, the great French writer, who had discreetly attended her presentation. The author of Les Misérables had found in Rosa's words an echo of his own convictions about the dignity of the oppressed. "Madame la Comtesse," the writer told her with moved voice, "your words today have resonated in my heart, like an echo of our era's deepest truths. You have demonstrated that the most powerful revolution is not carried out with weapons, but with books and teachers." The conversation that followed extended until dawn, exploring connections between education, social justice, and political transformation. Rosa shared with Hugo the complete story of her ascent from the Botafogo Palace Gardens to Parisian salons, revealing how each stage of her personal experience had informed her understanding of marginalized sectors' educational needs. "My dear Countess," Hugo reflected while they contemplated together the Parisian dawn from the hotel windows, "your life embodies our century's most beautiful promise, that true love and genuine education can overcome any barrier imposed by ignorance and prejudice." It was during that nocturnal conversation that Rosa made the most transcendental decision of her adult life. Inspired by international recognition of her work and understanding that her experience could benefit communities beyond Brazilian borders, she decided to establish an international network of educational institutions that would apply her methods in different cultural contexts. The project, which she baptized as Gardens of Hope in honor of her mother, would include schools in Paris for immigrants from French colonies, educational programs in London for industrial workers, and training centers in Italy for young peasants. Each institution would adapt the fundamental principles of democratic education to their community's specific needs. When she returned to her suite that dawn, Rosa found a letter from the Count that had arrived by diplomatic mail. His words, written from Rio de Janeiro, where he personally supervised institutions in her absence, revealed profound understanding of the historical transcendence of the moment she was living. "My beloved Rosa," Rodolfo wrote, "although distance separates us physically, I feel we have never been more spiritually united. Each triumph you achieve in Paris is also my triumph, because it represents the culmination of dreams we have built together. The orphanage children ask about you every day, and when I read them your letters describing your experiences at the Congress, I see in their eyes the same hope I saw in yours that first morning among the orchids." The letter continued informing about developments in Brazilian institutions. 3 of her former students had been admitted to European universities, 2 had established their own schools in remote provinces, and 1 had been appointed to an important position in the Imperial Education Ministry. Each individual achievement confirmed the efficacy of methods Rosa had developed and was now sharing with the world. But the letter's final paragraph contained a revelation that completely transformed her perspective on the meaning of her mission in Paris. "I have received news that Emperor Dom Pedro II plans to name you as the empire's first Minister of Popular Education, a position created specifically for you. Your work has transcended the limits of private philanthropy to become state policy. When you return, you will have the opportunity to implement on a national scale the principles you have defended for so many years." Rosa felt her heart accelerate at the magnitude of possibilities opening before her. The appointment would make her the first woman to occupy a ministerial position in Brazil's history and would grant her the necessary resources to radically transform the national educational system. Contemplating Paris's lights that were beginning to illuminate with evening, Rosa experienced a sensation of plenitude that transcended any personal satisfaction. Her life, which had begun among the shadows of marginal origin, had evolved to become a symbol of the transformative possibilities of love, education, and human determination. The child who had been rejected by aristocratic society had become the woman who would lead the democratization of education throughout an entire empire. The circle was closing in the most beautiful possible way, using the power that love had placed in her hands to open similar opportunities to thousands of other young people who, like she once had, dreamed of transcending the limitations of their origin. 20 years later, Rio de Janeiro, 1885. The garden of the Botafogo Palace had transformed into a true botanical sanctuary where Rosa's orchids, now multiplied into hundreds of varieties, created a color tapestry that changed with the seasons. The Portuguese stone paths, polished by decades of loving steps, led toward a lookout from where Guanabara Bay was contemplated with the same magnificence that had captivated the young couple 30 years earlier. Rosa, at 52 years old, had achieved that serene beauty that only fully realized life's grant. Her hair, now silver like lunar reflections on water, was gathered in an elegant chignon that framed a face where time's lines told stories of wisdom and compassion. Her honey-colored eyes retained the same intelligent gleam that had conquered the Count's heart 3 decades earlier, but enriched now by the depth that a life dedicated to serving others grants. The Count of Ipanema, at 57 years old, maintained the aristocratic bearing that had distinguished him since his youth, but his elegance had been enriched with the dignity of one who has used his privileges to create a better world. His love for Rosa had deepened over the years, until becoming something that transcended romantic passion to reach the dimension of perfect spiritual communion. That April afternoon of 1885, while they strolled through the gardens that had witnessed their first encounter, they celebrated multiple reasons for satisfaction. The national popular education system, implemented during the 12 years Rosa had served as Minister of Education, had radically transformed educational opportunities throughout the Brazilian Empire. The statistics spoke for themselves. Literacy had increased from 15% to 60% of the population. More than 1,000 popular schools functioned according to methods developed by Rosa, and hundreds of young people from humble origins now occupied important positions in public administration, liberal professions, and commerce. "Do you remember that morning when you found me watering the orchids?" Rosa asked while caressing the petals of a variety she had specially developed, and that bore the scientific name Orchidaceae Rodolphi, in honor of her husband. "As if it were yesterday," he responded, gently taking her hands in his with the same gesture he had performed thousands of times during their years of marriage. "I never imagined that that mysterious young woman who cared for flowers would become the continent's most respected educator." Their 4 children, now adults, had inherited not only noble titles, but also the social commitment that had characterized their parents. Rodolfo Carlos, 31 years old, had been elected deputy for Rio de Janeiro province and led legislative reforms that would definitively consolidate the democratic education system. Carlos Henrique had established an arts school where talented young people, regardless of their social origin, could develop their creative capacities. Maria Rosa, converted into an internationally recognized botanist, directed experimental gardens that had been established in connection with agricultural schools. Her work had revolutionized cultivation techniques, significantly increasing small rural properties' productivity. Fana Esperanza, the youngest, had directly followed her mother's footsteps, establishing orphanages and schools in the empire's most remote provinces. Her natural capacity to connect with abandoned children had made it possible to rescue and educate thousands of little ones who otherwise would have grown up on the streets. Rosa's educational legacy had extended far beyond Brazilian borders. The Gardens of Hope functioned successfully in 6 countries, adapting their pedagogical methods to different cultural contexts, but always maintaining fundamental principles of respect for human dignity and integral development of individual capacities. Victor Hugo, who had maintained regular correspondence with Rosa during the last years of his life, had written shortly before his death, Madame la Comtesse de Ipanema has demonstrated that the most powerful revolution is that which is carried out in children's hearts and minds. Her work will endure when marble monuments have been reduced to dust. That April afternoon, while they contemplated together the sunset from their favorite lookout, Rosa and the Count received a visit that would become a perfect symbol of what they had managed to build together. José de Silva Paranhos, the former shoemaker's son who had become an engineer thanks to educational opportunities provided by Rosa, arrived accompanied by his wife and children to personally thank his benefactors. "Senora Countess," he said with moved voice while bowing respectfully, "I have come to communicate that the government has appointed me director of the new National Technology Institute. My first official act will be to establish a scholarship program that will bear the name Rosa de Mendonça Program, to guarantee that talented young people from all origins can access higher education." Rosa felt tears moisten her eyes as she contemplated that man who perfectly embodied the dream that had animated all her work. José represented thousands of young people whose lives had been transformed by educational opportunities she had created, and who now used their positions to create similar opportunities for following generations. "José," she murmured with emotion-laden voice, "your success is the most beautiful reward I could expect for all the years of work. But what makes me most proud is seeing you converted not only into a successful professional, but into a person committed to others' welfare." The conversation that followed extended into the night, exploring future plans to continue expanding educational opportunities. José had developed projects to establish technical schools in all provincial capitals, using methodologies that combined Rosa's pedagogical principles with the latest European technological innovations. When they finally said goodbye, Rosa and the Count remained in the garden contemplating stars that were beginning to shine over Guanabara Bay. The night jasmine perfume intensified with the sea breeze, creating an atmosphere of almost supernatural perfection. "Did you ever imagine that our love story would have such transcendental consequences?" the Count asked, while gently embracing his wife. "True love always transcends those who live it," Rosa responded with wisdom she had acquired during decades of reflection. "When two people truly love each other and use that love to serve others, they create waves of transformation that extend far beyond what they can imagine." Her words resonated in the nocturnal quiet, like a perfect synthesis of the philosophy that had guided their lives. The love that had bloomed among orchids had multiplied in countless forms, touching thousands of people's lives and transforming an entire empire's social structures. Dona Maria das Dores, who had died 3 years earlier at 85 years old, had lived long enough to see the complete triumph of the girl she had raised as her own daughter. Her last words, pronounced while Rosa held her hand during agony, had been, "Minha filha, você se tornou tudo o que sua mãe Esperança sonhou que seria. My daughter, you have become everything your mother Esperança dreamed you would be." The Viscount of Botafogo, deceased 2 years before, had dedicated his last years to writing family memoirs where he officially recognized all his past errors and celebrated the belated but genuine pride he felt for Rosa. His last wishes had established that his entire fortune be destined to expand his recognized daughter's educational works. Adelaide Christina, completely transformed by years of collaboration with Rosa, had found in directing social assistance programs a personal fulfillment that compensated for her youth's vanities. Her joint work with her daughter-in-law had definitively healed past wounds. Even Eugenia had managed to overcome initial resentments to become an active collaborator in Rosa's works. Her marriage with the merchant, initially accepted out of desperation, had evolved toward modest but authentic happiness. Her children deeply admired their Aunt Rosa and had been educated according to the same principles of equality and social service. Madame Dubois, redeemed by sincere repentance, had dedicated her last years to directing teacher training programs, using her pedagogical experience to form educators who would apply Rosa's methods in institutions throughout the empire. While they contemplated Rio de Janeiro's lights that shone like terrestrial stars reflecting in the bay's waters, Rosa and the Count experienced that spiritual plenitude known only by those who have lived truly significant lives. "Our children will continue the work," Rosa murmured, resting her head on her husband's shoulder, "and our students' children will carry it even further. We have planted seeds that will bloom for generations." "Like the orchids you cultivated in this garden," he responded, gently caressing her silver hair. "Each flower generates new flowers. Each act of love multiplies love in the world." The night breeze gently stirred the palm leaves while the couple remained embraced under the stars, aware they had managed to create something that transcended their individual lives. Their love had generated a legacy of social transformation that would continue flourishing long after their voices had been silenced. In the Botafogo Palace gardens, orchids continued blooming with the same mysterious beauty that had captivated the Count during his first encounter with Rosa. But now each flower seemed to whisper the story of a love that had demonstrated its power to transform not only two hearts, but an entire society. The last words Rosa whispered that night, while they headed toward the palace hand in hand as they had done thousands of times during 30 years of marriage, perfectly summarized the essence of what they had built together. True love is like the most beautiful flowers. When it finds appropriate conditions to flourish, it beautifies the entire garden that surrounds it. Their steps slowly moved away along the Portuguese stone paths, leaving behind the eternal perfume of jasmine and the certainty that they had written, with their intertwined lives, one of the most transformative love stories of their era.